So, very important. I think, finally, there could be some problems for Benjamin Netanyahu, and also, unfortunately, there could be some problems for Europe. We'll let Alistar break it down. So, I'll keep my opinions short and sweet, as usual.
Welcome back. We are joined again by Alistar Crooke, former British diplomat and negotiator with decades of experience on conflicts in the Middle East. Alistar Crooke is also the founder and director of the Conflicts Forum. So to make sure to read this insightful Substack, and I have left a link in the description. So thank you very much for coming back on the program.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So you recently wrote an article also published on your Substack on the geopolitics of the world being reset by the Iran war. I was wondering if you could unpack some of this. Why is it that Iran is not just a strategic defeat for the US, a regional crisis, but also, again, the world of geopolitics also being impacted by this?
I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, there are three countries that are being directly impacted by that. First of all is Israel. There is a crisis in Israel. I was just reading this morning the reporting from Israel that Netanyahu is in despair at the possibility of an agreement, completely opposed to it, in complete despair, and concerned about his future, because, as you know, there are cases pending against him, which could end up with him having to go to jail, corruption cases, long-standing ones, but are still ongoing, and for which legal authorities suggest, if they do go to conclusion, he might be convicted. And the other aspect of this is the elections and the pardon that Trump has been trying to produce for him. And so far, it hasn't produced a pardon. In fact, what Netanyahu is asking for is the complete erasure of the cases against him. All of those cases I've just described, that they should be just taken off the charge sheet and put in the garbage. And so far, that hasn't happened either. And so there is thought. And again, I emphasize, this is Israeli speculation in Israel, that it may be preferable for Netanyahu to resign and to leave the government early than face defeat in election in, say, September or October. It seems it's likely the election will be in September, not October, because October will resonate not well with many Israelis for the 7th of October. And therefore he wants to distance himself from that. But it's looking as if he's desperate because the pardon is not coming through. A deal is not coming through that would allow him, even if he gets a pardon, he's refusing it as it stands because he's not going to admit guilt, and that is required under Israeli law. And the tensions are growing enormously because there's now Israelis having been hugely enthusiastic at the outset that America was going to come in and, the greatest power in the world was going to join with Israel and effectively destroy Iran. That's what they want, the destruction of Iran. And now is being internalized in Israel that this isn't going to be the outcome. In fact, Iran has won the war, and therefore has won the war for Israel, in the sense that Israel has lost the war, as well as America lost the war, but Israel even more, it has lost the war, and is calling into question, deep issues. People have said this, is the collapse of the whole, greater Israel. project, because, you know, Israel is now stuck with how many is it? 5, 6 unwinnable wars. And everywhere they're not going particularly well. Gaza, or West Bank, or Lebanon particularly is going bad. But all of these are not going very, very, very well. And as the Chief of Staff said, you know, if we were to manage this, we'd need 6 more IDFs than the IDF we have. So, you know, they're stuck in unwinnable war with not enough troops and no.
And that's the thing. When people say, does Israel have a right to exist? Like, can you define the borders, please? If you show us, if they stick to their borders, then let the Palestinians have their state, then yeah. But if the borders just expand and expand, then what, does Greater Israel have a right to exist? Like, I don't know how the Western media just, well, we know why.
Particular way out of this. You know, Iran was supposed to be the magic bullet, which would take Israel out of this deepening crisis into a different period. So some people, and I'm not pretending that this is a majority or large, but you're starting to see quite serious high-level people in Israel sort of saying, you know, at the end of this, we have to go back to what Ben-Gurion originally said, you know, that Israel is a small country, territorial, few resources, small public, small population. We have to stay within our borders. And he also endorsed the Clausewitzian formula that war is an extension of politics rather than politics an extension of war. And so Ben-Gurion's view was that Israel couldn't afford a big army. It could have a small army, professional army, and it had to rely on reservists. And so people are going back and saying, you know, well, we've gone quite wrong in this. Now we're overextended everywhere on this huge project to turn Israel into the hegemon of the Middle East. And it's all going wrong. And now we're trapped in all of these wars we've started. And so there's people saying, well, you know, we need to go back to the Ben-Gurion model. We need to stay within our borders. And there are other people saying, well, you know, look, this way of dealing with the Iranian problem is not working. It's not going to produce a solution. This attempt to get United States to destroy Iran is not going to work. And so we need a solution, and perhaps we need to rethink the whole of the Zionist project and look at it from a different perspective. Now, it's only, you know, these are things that are, these are currents that are surfacing. And if they haven't reached fullness, I think partly because of the huge uncertainty about what Trump is going to do and what's going to happen in America and what's going to happen to the world economies. So they're not there, but this is a really important inflection point for Israel, because the polls show that Netanyahu is likely to lose for the first time. I've always been one who said, you know, he's Mr. Teflon Man. He will always escape, and people predicting he's about to disappear have usually been wrong. And I've always said, you know, he slithers around and he gets out of these political problems. I'm not so sure. You know, the government with the problems over conscription and the Orthodox groups in Israel, I'm not sure he's going to get out of this this time. And I think the opposition is growing, and it's growing. The criticism of this war in Iran is getting really very strong and very broad. So, you know, the government might implode. And think about that. If Netanyahu's gone, who would you think of who could sort of carry, you know, the wide government, you know, agenda on his shoulders from Ben-Gvir, to all of the Likud, who would carry that on their shoulders? And maybe the whole project, the whole structure, political structure that Netanyahu's built up over these 20 years or so could implode, and everything would, disappear into factions and internal faction fighting. I don't know, but I'm just saying there's a big question mark on that. And you asked me about why I said other things are changing too. I think it's very clear Russia is changing. I think we've seen an inflection point in Russia. And a very senior Russian figure who's been in the sort of shadows of power for 20 years or more, Sergei Karaganov, has said explicitly in a paper that he wrote, pointing to Russia needing to take the lessons from Iran. And particularly what he was pointing to explicitly was how Iran had used conventional missile weapons to hit vulnerable American Western targets. And when Iran did that, the West backed off and withdrew. And he said, we need to learn from the Iran. We need to take the Iran lessons into our backyard. Originally, it was, it came out and has become the center of his attention. And so this has moved his ideas, and he was saying, we have to go back to nuclear deterrence too. People don't believe in our deterrence anymore. We had it in the 50s, nuclear deterrence, and it worked. But then the Soviet Union imploded, and the West became, euphoric. And, now if you mention that Russia is a nuclear power, the neocons have a refrain which they pour out all the time. Oh, Alistar, that's just blah. That would be, Putin would never dare. NATO, and now we have the whole of NATO and its GDP and its military against Russia. That changes the whole question. No, it doesn't. And so Karaganov has said, fear and the sense that there is, that behind the conventional weapons, and he's clear, the first line is conventional weapons, and he urges Russia to really press on with developing new conventional weapons. But ultimately, he says, at the last resort, when your survival is in peril, you need people to fear the nuclear weapon. And actually, I agree that that will be a European interest when Europeans are, frothing at the mouth with, war with Russia all the time in a sort of increasing frenzy of talking about, Russia, and Europeans saying, and actually digging in even further and saying, well, we can't talk. And what's more, we're going to put sanctions on anyone that uses Russian oil or gas, even if it's bought from third parties, from India or roundabout ways. We're going to stop all of that. I mean, in the sort of suicidal, run at the cliff for the Europeans to sort of follow each other over like sheep over the cliff into an economic decline, as they find that energy from America is much more expensive than the energy they used to have. And so I think it's not just at the public level, but at the top level, there's a change of mood. And you've probably seen it, be aware. The Anchorage understandings are over. Lavrov made that clear and said Europeans are partly to blame. And quite clearly, they are understanding this cannot go on. This ratcheting by Europe of more and more support for Ukraine in terms of missiles and drones The UK in April announced it was going to send 120,000 more drones and long distance missiles to Ukraine. And they're using NATO's airspace and land in the Baltic province to fire them into St. Petersburg and other places, assuming that because it's NATO space, then Article 5 of the NATO treaty would give them protection against any retribution from Russia. Well, they may be mistaken. Maybe things are going to change. But I think what Russia said was slightly different. They said, now we will attack the decision-making centers. And I think what they mean by that is the decision-making center is not in Latvia. They know exactly where it is. It's in Britain, it's in France, and in Germany. That's where the war plan of sort of ratcheting escalation is hatched, not in Latvia. Latvia is just a tool in this process. So I think that is changing rapidly.
And this is the thing, like, would you blame them? Would you blame Putin and the Russians for finally saying, look, enough's enough. Look what Iran have done with the GCC. They were complicit and compliant and letting the US use the air bases there, launch attacks from there. We in the UK and in Germany and in France are doing exactly the same by funding Ukraine against Russia. And it's just, why can't we all just live in peace? Like, we could have cheaper energy from Russia, have good relations with Russia. It's just going to end bad, like, unfortunately it is.
And I think probably in the wake of the summit in Beijing, where Putin and Xi met, I think what we see is, China does it not openly, not with missiles and not with a great deal of noise, but they're really pushing back against the United States in economic terms, forbidding that Chinese or citizens can buy from in the US stock market, stopping, if you like, the other sort of ways through digital currencies that America is trying to expand the dollar market. And they are doing the opposite. And with now the Eurotier saying that there are bonds from China are effectively good collateral. Good collateral in this case means equivalent to cash. It becomes part of the deep bond market of China. So they're pushing back at the attempts by the United States to squeeze China in its capex, its capital expenditure, its availability of capital. It's just increased the bond market, Chinese bond market. Even European states now issuing bonds denominated in yuan. And so it's pushing back on various fronts. It's not a lot of news. It's not making a lot of noise. But just as Russia has moved, I think, into a new sphere, China has moved into quiet but very forceful measures to limit American expansion. I mean, look what's happened to NVIDIA. And it's the Chinese have just taken the whole of the Chinese market back again for themselves. So those are the sort of areas. So everything is sort of heating up, it seems to me, and is much more hard-nosed towards the West as a whole, Russia particularly against Europe. I mean, very, very viscerally angry with Europe.
And this is it. I mean, the petrodollar is evaporating in front of Trump's eyes. And people are realizing there is more stability coming from the East, from China. And look at Venezuela. China had spent a lot of money making the facilities to distill the crude oil that comes from Venezuela. and Trump just decided to take it. How long can you poke the bear? How long? Because everyone in the West is complacent. And you look at Iran, you look at Russia, and even China. They have citizens who are loyal to the cause, willing to, in Iran's case, willing to be martyred for the Persian Empire. In Russia, willing to die for the motherland. Who's going to go and fight for us? Seriously? Unfortunately, I think something bad is going to happen, but there we go.